I grew up in a huge fan of superheroes. That's right. That's my wife whistling at me. You go ahead, keep whistling, baby. As a kid, I watched all the hero TV shows, if you grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Come on, the original, not the revised version. How many of you remember old school Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Come on, give it up. That's right. G.I. Joe, real American hero. G.I. Joe. Okay. So every episode ended the same way, and they would come to this conclusion, and knowing, and they'd say, and knowing is half the battle, right? So He-Man, top right there, you teenagers have no idea what I'm talking about. Say it with me if you've raised them in the generation. I have the power. There we go. Okay, beautiful. Thundercats, Lion-O and the other Thundercats. I had all of those. I was addicted to the Thundercats. And the X-Men. The X-Men were a great animated series. So I watched all these shows growing up, you know. I watched all the hero movies. I read the hero comics. My favorite superhero of all time is Superman. And I know that's vanilla, right? Okay, but if you know me, you know that's me. That's why I was going to wear a footsie pajama Superman costume for you today. But I decided that might be a little distracting and you wouldn't be able to hear anything else I say, so I wore the plaid like I always wear. Superman's my favorite. Any other Superman fans out there? Yeah. Then the rest of you are Batman fans. Come on, how many Batman fans, right? You're one or the other, but maybe you were a little girl, you grew up, and Wonder Woman. Come on, Wonder Woman fans out there. This was the most appropriate picture I could choose for a Sunday morning, the comic book version. But Wonder Woman, I mean, we grew up with these heroes, but the real question is, did you watch the greatest hero show of all times, The A-Team? Come on, you do not mess with B.A. Baracus. I pity the fool. You know, you don't mess with him. Now, teenagers, if nothing of what I just said makes any sense to you, ask mom and dad when you go home. They will tell you, and they will relive their glory days and their favorite shows. But heroes are kind of in vogue right now, really, you know. I like many of you, have watched the Avengers movies. What Marvel has done, I've been entertained by, I've been in awe of. These movies have been incredible. For the past 10 years, they've created a universe full of heroes. And for the past decade, we've been blown away, and we've been in awe by these movies, the collective Avenger movies and these standalone movies. I'm a nerd. I nerd out on this stuff. I can't wait for Star Wars to come out, okay? So, like, in the most recent ones that came out, Endgame and Spider-Man Far From Home, I mean, I'm there, opening night, you know, I'm watching this at midnight kind of stuff. Because we all love a good hero story. And I think there's something inside all of us that wishes it could be somebody's hero. But hero status doesn't seem accessible or even realistic, does it? I mean, after all, we don't live in a movie. It's not a comic book. This is real life. And so today I want to share a single question that I think makes hero status accessible, that Jesus asked. And so what is a hero? We got to wrap our brain around what we think a hero is. We know a hero is someone who saves the day. We all know that, right? I mean, they save the day. Sometimes they save the universe. Sometimes they save the planet. But for sure, they save somebody. Which means that the whole idea of being a hero is a little bit unrealistic, inaccessible. Because if heroes save the day, then we probably can't be one because they save the day. And that sort of kind of puts it out of our reach because we go to work, we go to school, we come home, and we can celebrate others who might do things like that. But we're not going to ever have the opportunity to save the day. And so it kind of makes it a little bit inaccessible until Jesus comes along, and he's the master storyteller and the master communicator, and with one single question, check this out, he will take away all of our excuses not to be a hero. And not just for Christians. Listen, if you're here and you're not a Christian, not a church person, every single person in every nation, in every generation, he's going to take away our excuses to be a hero and make it accessible and realistic. So I want to tell you a story that happened in the life of Jesus and explain the question that he asks, because I think for every single one of us, it will challenge us, no matter how old or young we are, what our religious beliefs might be, what we've experienced in life. This will be the on-ramp for you to become the hero, to save the day for somebody. So here's how the story goes. On one occasion, which means that this has happened before, many times, similar conversations, similar experiences like the one we are about to talk about. On one occasion, this particular occasion, an expert in the religious law, the Old Testament Jewish scriptures, an expert, an attorney, stood up to test Jesus. He's actually going to ask Jesus a question, a trick question, because that's what they did. They were always trying to trap Jesus all the time. They followed him everywhere he went. And he said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Which is a really good question. I think we would all probably want to hear Jesus' answer to that question. But Jesus is Jesus, and he knows that that wasn't the real question. He knew that there's a question behind the question. This guy's got ulterior motives, so what does Jesus do? Because he's Jesus. He asks the question to the question. He responds with a question. He says to the expert, well, okay, what's written in the law? I mean, you're the expert, right? You're the expert, so how do you read it? What do you think it says? And so what the lawyer says next is a very appropriate thing, because what he says next is he actually quotes the Old Testament Jewish scriptures, the verse that every single Jewish boy and girl grew up memorizing. Jesus memorized it as a boy. The attorney memorized it as a boy. Everybody in the audience knew and could recite this verse by heart, because this verse was the answer to these questions. What does God want most? How do you get in good with God? What's the greatest commandment? How do you have eternal life? How do you ensure God will listen to your prayers and answer your prayers? All of these questions could be answered by this one single verse. It's the most important verse that a boy or girl growing up in Israel could have learned. So the expert in the law answered like everybody would. So, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And if you know it, say it with me. With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And just like you, reading it along with me, because you've heard it before, everybody in Jesus' audience is nodding in agreement as this attorney begins to say it. They're reciting along with the expert in the law. It's like, we know this, we sing the national anthem, we put our hand on our heart, we know the words, we sing along. So as soon as he started reciting this, they're probably all saying it out loud too. This is so well known. So it's the correct answer. So let's pause there for a second. It's the correct answer to the question. But this attorney, this religious leader, had been a part of some of the earlier conversations that Jesus had on the similar subject. He was there before when some of the other guys tried to trap Jesus and had another conversation trying to trick Jesus. And so one of them asked this question to Jesus a little bit of a different way. Let's read this. They said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Similar question asked a different way. In other words, what makes God most happy? What's the top priority for God for us to do? So Jesus answered the question just like he was raised to answer, like everybody was raised to answer. And he says, okay, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. He says this is the first and the greatest commandment. But Jesus adds a second part. This is revolutionary. This is not what they memorized. They were not raised to add the second part. And he adds the second part. Yes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, your soul. But that's great. But the second is like it, just as important to it, on equal footing as it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we don't get this because we live in the 21st century, but I'm telling you that when he said those words and he added that second part, that everybody knew was the correct answer, and then he adds a part to the correct answer. How do you get eternal life? What's the greatest commandment? What does God want most? When he added a second part, man, a ripple goes through that crowd, because now, and you know this if you grew up in church, you do not mess with tradition, right? You don't mess with that sister so-and-so's seat. Oh, we don't change that. That's how they do it. We've done it this way. Tradition, man, you don't mess with that. It'll upset a lot of people. And Jesus, he messes with tradition. I love this about Jesus. He was a revolutionary. He's messing with what they had learned as boys and girls. And he's adding to something. And this signals, and don't miss this signals something huge. No longer, we've been talking about this the last couple of weeks, no longer are we to be only concerned with the vertical relationship with God. Am I done enough to make God happy? Am I doing what God wants me to do? Now the horizontal affects the vertical, the way that we treat people around us. That affects our standing with God. So the second part that Jesus added actually comes from the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament. And what's significant about this verse is that the author, who was inspired to write it, Moses, he actually defines what a neighbor is to these people. So here's the passage we're going to read in a second that Jesus was quoting from when he said, love the Lord your God. That comes from Deuteronomy. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. He's quoting Moses. And then to get to the neighbor part, he quotes from the book of Leviticus, another one of the books that Moses wrote. What does it mean to be a neighbor? He actually defines what a neighbor is. And Moses says this back in Leviticus. He says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people. Have you ever heard somebody say the term, my people? Well, these are my people, right? It's like my tribe. It's a popular saying. You might have said it. You might have heard it. These are not my people. These are my people. It's an affectionate way that we use to refer to people who are like us. We have things in common with. It's our tribe. Maybe it's our family, right? And if you've ever said this or heard this said, you may not have realized it, but you're actually quoting the Old Testament Jewish scriptures. These are my people. And what this verse basically meant was, when it comes to how you treat people, make sure you don't bear a grudge or seek revenge on anybody who is your people. But in contrast to that, bearing a grudge or seeking revenge, when it comes to your people or your neighbor, instead, love them. Love them. And the author wanted to make sure that they knew what a neighbor was. And do you know what a neighbor was to the Old Testament Jewish people who were reading these Jewish scriptures? Their neighbors were other Jewish people. Your people, a Jew's neighbor, was other Jewish people. To love another Jew was like loving themselves because they were loving other Jews. Now, everybody knew that. So if you asked anybody on the streets in Jerusalem or in Galilee or in any of the Jewish towns who their neighbors were, they would all respond the same way: other Jewish people. And that was it. And that was their framework. That was their understanding. So let's go back to Jesus' conversation with this attorney who's in the audience before when Jesus adds the second part: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. He was there probably to hear Jesus add that second part. And so he's coming to Jesus now, and knowing that Jesus is going to add that second part again, because Jesus was asked similar questions, and we have moments in the Gospels of conversations that he probably had over and over again. And these guys following him, knowing that he's going to add that part again, this attorney asks Jesus, what do you think I have to do to inherit eternal life? And the attorney says what everybody in the audience, as we've already recited, would say, and you understand: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, all that. And then the attorney grins, I'm sure, because he knows that he said the right answer, but he's also been a part of Jesus' conversations before to add the second part. And Jesus, I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor. He knew this already, but this attorney is up to something. He's not trying to get the right answer for the sake of the right answer. He's trying to answer the answer that Jesus already gave, to give back to Jesus so he could trap Jesus. He's got a question under the question. He's trying to trick Jesus. It's manipulation. And Jesus smiles because this guy answers the question completely correctly. He didn't get part of it. He got all of it. Jesus says, you answered correctly. And that's a rare thing to a question that Jesus would ask. You didn't just give the first half, love the Lord your God, with your heart, mind, soul, strength. You gave the second part. You got it all right. You realize it's not just about keeping God happy, eyes on the sky, vertical relationship with Jesus, with God. You realize it's all about loving your neighbor too. Great. If you do this, you will live. And Jesus, he's done teaching. Boom, mic drop, truth. They get it. Leave. And Jesus he's Jesus, so he knows what's going on. But he knows that this attorney isn't there to ask the question and then to move on. He's got another question, the trick question, a question under the question. That's going to drive the wedge between Jesus and the crowd so they could finally arrest him. But the attorney wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus the question beneath the question, the trick question that he knows Jesus is going to hang himself with. And who, Jesus, is my neighbor? You just hear the arrogance, right? You can just kind of sense the way that I've got you now. This guy's like, Jesus, you can't just walk away and not answer specifically. Love your neighbor. That's too broad, too generic. Be more specific. What's the minimum amount? Remember, they're Jewish people listening to Jesus talk to them about a Jewish concept. So their neighbor idea was other Jews, right? That's my neighbor. So what's the minimum amount of love I need to give to my neighbors around me? What's the least amount expected? Jesus. And Jesus, he never gives the least amount expected, right? And the question's sitting out there. Who is my neighbor? It's waiting to be answered. And I love this about Jesus. He launches, to answer the question, he launches into one of his most disorienting, paradigm-shifting, radical parables and stories that he ever shared. So the question, who is my neighbor? And everybody's waiting for Jesus to answer. And I love this about Jesus. He smiles and he says, well, let me tell you, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. Okay, hold on, whoa. Jesus, wait. That's not what I asked. Who is my neighbor? You're changing the subject. You do this all the time, Jesus. We ask you a simple question, and then you tell a story that has nothing to do with the question that we've asked. And so just focus for a second. Answer the question. And I love this about Jesus. Back to the story. So a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when they were attacked by robbers. And they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and they went away, leaving him half dead. Why did they take his clothes? Because clothes were so valuable back then. And so if you were going to harm someone or kill someone, you always took their clothes because that had great value. So he was beaten, he was stripped, he was left for dead. And this story, as we know it, it's called the parable of the Good Samaritan. You probably heard that before. And it's not just a story or a parable. It's become what we call an idiom. It's something that we still use. The terminology still is used today, right? You'll turn on the news and it's 2,000 years later, but that woman was close to death, and then along came a good Samaritan and helped her out. Or those teenagers were in the right place at the right time, and they became good Samaritans to help that elderly person out. Good Samaritan. It's an idiom. It's 2,000 years ago, Jesus introduced a word picture that has continued to impact and influence our culture today. And it impacts you. And we'll see how that's true in just a moment, because when we get to the question that Jesus is going to land the plane with and land the story with that causes everybody to go into a tizzy and an uproar, see, 2,000 years ago, this changed everything. And if you're here and you're not a church person, you're not a religious person, then listen, this is why you're going to hear me say you should follow Jesus, because it will make your life better and it will make you better at life. You don't have to believe everything to follow. Just take one step. And if you're into the whole Good Samaritan idea, doing good things for other people, you have already taken your step in the direction of following Jesus. Because this is what Jesus called people to do. This is how Jesus lived his life. And here's what you have to understand. What Jesus was about to say was not common. The world was about to change. This was a hinge moment in the life of Jesus and in the life of the world. And listen, if everybody in our town or in our community just did what Jesus is about to say, if everybody in your home just did what Jesus is about to say, it would change everything, because it's so powerful. We're still talking about it 2,000 years later. Okay, back to the story. This man had been beaten and stripped and left for dead, and then these two religious men who were Jewish religious leaders come from Jerusalem to Jericho, and they see this beaten, bruised, bloody Jewish man. And they decide to pass by this Jewish man as Jewish leaders. This is their neighbor, and they don't lift a finger to help him. In fact, they probably thought he deserved it, because there was a lot of thinking in those days that way. What goes around comes around, right? If you're bruised and bleeding, then you deserve to be bruised and bleeding. If you're not bruised and bleeding, then you deserve not to be bruised and bleeding. So why would not bruised and bleeding interfere with bruised and bleeding? I'm just going to go about my merry way because you're getting what you deserved. And that's how many people back then thought. In fact, there are places in the world today that still believe this way. You could have been beaten and robbed and lying half dead on the street, and other people will consider it karma. You're just getting what you deserve, and they won't help you. And before I move on, let me tell you why you don't believe that. You don't believe that whether you're aware of it or not, whether you're a religious person or not, because of the teachings of Jesus that has so heavily influenced our Western civilization that this has become normal now. We help people, good Samaritans. But in other cultures that haven't embraced or been influenced by the kingdom of God and the teachings of Jesus, they do not embrace that ideology or that thinking. So what we do, because we have been, and whether you're a Christian or not, a church person or not, people around you will care to help you because of Jesus, and you should thank Jesus for that, even if you're not a Christian. But if what Jesus is saying is true, that to love God means that you love your neighbor, if that's true, the only way you can be good with God is if you are good and kind and loving to your neighbor. If the vertical is affected by the horizontal, then these two Jewish religious leaders who passed by this bruised and bleeding Jewish neighbor, well, they were doomed. Because they did not love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. Because they did not love their neighbor as themselves. They didn't love their Jewish neighbor. And everybody in Jesus' crowd, hearing Jesus tell this story, gets the point. They get the implication. I mean, you can hear a pin drop, but he's not done with the story. These two religious leaders, they don't just pass by. They go to the opposite side of the road, as far away from him as they can, and they pass by as they continue on their way where they were going. And then, Jesus, because he's just so great, says, but a Samaritan. Now, I can't, in words, articulate the tension in those three words. But a Samaritan. Now, you might have heard that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along, but it was way bigger than that, folks. The best way to describe the relationship between Samaritans and Jews was institutionalized racism. This is what it was. It was like apartheid. Everybody knew the rules. Everybody knew the boundaries. Nobody crossed them. Nobody went where they weren't supposed to go. Nobody questioned it. It's just the way that it was. Institutionalized racism. Jews didn't have anything to do with Samaritans. They wouldn't even travel in Samaria. They would go around. If going north, they would go the long way around to avoid going through Samaria. They wouldn't talk to Samaritans. They wouldn't touch Samaritans. They didn't marry Samaritans. They hated Samaritans, and Samaritans hated Jews. It was just the way that it was. Everybody knew it. Nobody questioned it. And Jesus, because he's Jesus, and it's incredible, even he knows the risk of losing his Jewish crowd as he transitions the conversation to this Samaritan. And this attorney must have been smiling, thinking to himself, oh, this is better than I imagined. This is better than I imagined, because if he makes the Samaritan the hero in this story, then this is game over for Jesus. This is a Jewish audience. They're gonna hang him. They're gonna take him into custody. It's safe to assume that most of those people listening to Jesus tell the story probably thought a Samaritan was responsible for beating the man. I mean, because when we hear the nightly news and we hear of what happens downtown or in the communities around Kansas City, we have a general idea of who we think probably committed that crime. And their prejudice and their racism is confronted. Oh, I know who does that. Samaritans do that. But if he's going to make the Samaritan the hero, this attorney's like, this is better than anything I could have ever imagined. But he's Jesus, and he does. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and he saw him. And the Samaritan did what the Jewish leaders did not. He took pity on the man. And Jesus, because he's Jesus, makes the Samaritan not just the hero of the story, but this guy who goes the extra mile. Are you kidding me? Who would do that sort of thing kind of hero? He went to this man and bandaged his wounds. It means he touched a Samaritan. He talked to a Samaritan. That doesn't happen for any reason. And they're freaking out. They're uncomfortable. The tension is awkward. And then he goes on to add to that, not only he poured expensive oil and wine on the wounds to heal the wounds, that would have come at incredible personal cost. Who would do such a thing? And then the man put the injured man on his own donkey. He walked so the Jewish man could ride. A Samaritan chose, this is crazy. Who would do that kind of thing? And then he brought him to an inn where he took care of him. And now listen, very few people in Jesus' audience would have done any of this for another Jew, let alone a Samaritan. And it kind of illustrates the radical nature of how Jesus wants us to love our neighbors. But he had more to say. And this is kind of I'm going to twist the knife and add more tension in the conversation as his audience is listening, already freaking out, probably going, where are you going with this? And Jesus continues, and he says, and the next day, whoa. Are you telling me that this Samaritan spent the night with the Jew all night long, keeping him alive, tending to his wounds, foregoing sleep and rest on his own so he could sleeplessly serve a Jewish, that's too ridiculous. I mean, it's one thing to make a phone call. It's one thing to drop him off somewhere where we can have help, but it's an entirely other thing to spend the entire night taking care of the injured man. I mean, does he really expect his audience to believe any of this? But Jesus continues with the incredible, unbelievable nature of the story, and he says the next day he took out 2 denarii and he gave them to the innkeeper. Look after the man, and when I return, and that's another, whoa. You mean this Samaritan is going to go away on business, on his journey, and he's going to come back for this Jewish man to check up on him? The expenses of that, the time it takes, it's so over the top. When I return, I will reimburse you for any expense that you might have. His audience is just leaning in. And I can only imagine that moment in that crowd. I'm sure there's tension. I'm sure people are chattering. I'm sure there's an uproar. And as it kind of settles down, I love this. Jesus did something that no one in his audience would live long enough to appreciate. Do you know what he does next? He redefines neighbor for everybody, in every nation and in every generation. From this point forward, for the rest of history, no one would have the freedom to define neighbor in terms of location alone. No one would have the permission, and no one would have the right, and no one would dare to limit the definition of neighbor to people who are just like themselves. To the shock and to the awe of his audience, Jesus expanded the definition of neighbor beyond Galilee and beyond Jerusalem, beyond a single ethnicity, beyond the boundaries of Israel. This is shocking. This is radical. I mean, we live in America in the 21st century, so we miss this. But listen, Jesus expanded even the definition of neighbor beyond the boundaries of the Jewish scriptures. To people who don't believe and have nothing in common with me and don't share the values and the ideologies and the beliefs that I do. All of this, Jesus, with one perfectly crafted question. It's the question that we're about to look at that causes all of us, whether we are Christians or not, to examine our hearts and examine whether or not there are still any prejudice there or racism within us. The question that forces all of us to examine whether there's hatred or contempt for any kinds of people who are not like us. And Jesus asked this question, don't miss this question. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? I mean, it's not a difficult question, right? What makes it so hard and so convicting and so weighty is that they knew the answer. Which of these 3 was the neighbor? Now, we missed this because we weren't in the first century. We weren't Jewish people. But the real question, the unabridged question that everybody in the audience that day heard Jesus asking loud and clear, the real question, which of these 3 loved the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength by loving a stranger as himself? That was the question that had shifted their thinking and impacted and changed the world. Which of these 3 treated a stranger, not another Jewish person, not a neighbor as they were growing up to think of a neighbor, but who treated a foreigner and a stranger, somebody completely different than them? Which of these 3 loved God like this by loving a stranger as himself? Which of these 3 was the hero? And it's in this moment that Jesus makes hero status accessible to you and to me. And it's in this question that he strips away every one of our excuses not to play the role of hero at some point in our life for someone. And the crowd is quiet. And the attorney, the expert in the law who came to trap Jesus and trick Jesus, is standing there. He doesn't have the words. He doesn't know what to say. He's searching for the answer. He knows the answer he's supposed to say, but he's standing there, no doubt, probably thinking, how did I get here? How did he trap me? I thought that was the perfect question to trap him. Why in the world would I ask such a dumb question? I should have learned by now how smart this Jesus is. And now this guy, this attorney's on the spot. Everybody's looking at him. Everybody's staring at him. What's your answer? And don't miss this. Because if he answers it out loud, and everybody knows the answer, if he answers it out loud, he becomes accountable to his own answer. All of you parents in the room get this, right? You try to get your kids to answer your questions so that they can admit that they know the answer. They know what they're supposed to do. They know what what they've heard you say. So they go on record, say, yeah, I need to be home by 10. Yeah, you said don't hit my sister. Yeah. So when they say it out loud, they are accountable now. They know what they're supposed to do. So our kids are crafty and smart because they're all really good sinners, mine just like yours, right? And they don't answer. They stay quiet. They give you the silent treatment. Or they walk out of the room, or they change the subject. Because they even know, once I say it, then I become accountable to it. And so the expert attorney in the law who had come to trick and to trap Jesus, who had a question behind the question, who had an agenda, the expert in the law replied. I mean, what else could he reply? The one. And listen, he couldn't even say the word Samaritan. His prejudice was so great, he had to use an adjective to describe the Samaritan, the one, that one. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. The one who had mercy on him. And I think Jesus is standing there, because I think Jesus has a lot of fun with people. He's got this big smile on his face, because he knows what just happened in this guy's heart. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Do not miss this. To this completely Jewish crowd, Jesus tells this Jewish religious leader, this expert attorney in the Jewish law, and all the other Jewish men and women who were in stunned silence listening, leaning in, hanging on every word that he was saying, okay, guys, I want you to be like the Samaritan. Be the Samaritan. Can you imagine what that moment must have been like? How awkward. You ever been in an awkward moment where it's tense? Nobody knows what to say. Nobody knows what to do. Something just changed in the world, and they knew it, and they were present. Because neighbor love no longer had ethnic or geographical boundaries. Now, according to Jesus, neighbor love is as big as the world. And it's not just limited to people who look like me, talk like me, act like me, believe like me, live like me. No, it's everyone. The days of neighbor love being confined to people who live in my neighborhood, those days are coming to an end. And here's why. Because very soon, after this conversation that Jesus had, Jesus would become a neighbor to everyone, everywhere, and in every generation. He would demonstrate his love for you, and 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 for me, by stooping down to bind up and to heal the sin wounds of this world. Because all of your problems and all of my problems all come from the same place. It stems from sin, which separates us from God. And Jesus, listen, Jesus would be the Samaritan for you and for me. When others would walk by, when we didn't deserve it and no one would care about us, he would show up, and he would love us and take care of us. And when he did, when he died on the cross and he rose from the dead, the world changed, because now the power of sin, the power of death, the power of hell was broken forever over us, so we could be free to live this life that loves the Lord our God and loves our neighbor as ourselves. Neighbor love would never be limited again. But that would cost him a lot more than 2 nights in a motel. It cost him his life. And I'm going to ask you the same question that he asked those that day. This terrifying question that makes hero status accessible and takes away all of our excuses. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? You already know who it is. It's the one who saw a need and met it. It's the one who knew the price and chose to pay it, and who didn't talk themselves out of it when the moment came. Which of these 3 loved the Lord, his God, with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength by loving a stranger as himself? Another way to ask it, which of these 3 was the hero? Which of these 3 was the hero in the story? Don't forget it. The one who saw a need and met it. The one who knew the price and paid it. and the one who didn't talk themselves out of it. And Jesus says to his audience, and he said to the attorney, and he said to the men and to the women, and he says it to you and to me. Okay, it's pretty simple. Go and do likewise. Be the Samaritan. Go and do likewise. Let's stand together. Go and be the hero. If you can meet a need this week, meet the need. If you can pay the price for someone this week. And don't talk yourself out of it. Because meeting needs and paying the price